The Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith. Read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 14. Begin the year with an unexpected promotion at the office. I make 2 good jokes. I get an enormous rise in my salary. Lupin speculates successfully and starts a pony trap. Have to speak to Sarah. Extraordinary conduct of Gowing's. January the 1st. I had intended concluding my diary last week, but a most important event has happened, so I shall continue for a little while longer on the fly-leaves attached to the end of my last year's diary. It had just struck 1:30, and I was on the point of leaving the office to have dinner when I received a message that Mr. Perkupp desired to see me at once. I must confess that my heart commenced to beat, and I had most serious misgivings. Mr. Perkupp was in his room writing, and he said, "Take a seat, Mr. Pooter, I shall not be a moment." I replied, "No, thank you, sir, I'll stand." I watched the clock on the mantelpiece, and I was watching quite 20 minutes, but it seemed hours. Mr. Perkupp at last got up himself. I said, "I hope there is nothing wrong, sir." He replied, "Oh dear no, quite the reverse, I hope." What a weight off my mind! My breath seemed to come back again in an instant. Mr. Perkupp said, "Mr. Buckling is going to retire, and there will be some slight changes in the office. You have been with us nearly 21 years, and, in consequence of your conduct during that period, we intend making a special promotion in your favour. We have not quite decided how you will be placed, but in any case there will be a considerable increase in your salary, which, it is quite unnecessary for me to say, you fully deserve. I have an appointment at 2, but you shall hear more tomorrow." He then left the room quickly, and I was not even allowed time or thought to express a single word of grateful thanks to him. I need not say how dear Carrie received the joyful news. With perfect simplicity she said, "At last we shall be able to have a chimney-glass for the back drawing-room, which we've always wanted." I added, "Yes, and at last you shall have that little costume which you saw at Peter Robinson's so cheap." January the 2nd. I was in a great state of suspense all day at the office. I did not like to worry Mr. Perkupp, but as he did not send for me, and mentioned yesterday that he would see me again to-day, I thought it better, perhaps, to go to him. I knocked at his door, and on entering Mr. Perkupp said, "Oh, it's you, Mr. Pooter. Do you want to see me?" I said, "No, sir, I thought you wanted to see me." "Oh," he replied, "I remember. Well, I am very busy to-day. I'll see you to-morrow." January the 3rd. Still in a state of anxiety and excitement, which was not alleviated by ascertaining that Mr. Perkupp sent word he should not be at the office to-day. In the evening, Lupin, who was busily engaged with a paper, said suddenly to me, "Do you know anything about chalk pits, Gov?" I said, "No, my boy, not that I am aware of." Lupin said, "Well, I give you the tip. Chalk pits are as safe as consols, and pay 6% at par." I said a rather neat thing, viz., they may be 6% at par, but your pa has no money to invest. Carrie and I both roared with laughter. Lupin did not take the slightest notice of the joke, although I purposely repeated it for him. But he continued, "I give you the tip, that's all, chalk pits." I said another funny thing. "Mind you don't fall into them." Lupin put on a supercilious smile and said, "Bravo, Joe Miller." January the 4th. Mr. Perkupp sent for me and told me that my position would be that of one of the senior clerks. I was more than overjoyed. Mr. Perkupp added he would let me know to-morrow what the salary would be. This means another day's anxiety. I don't mind, for it is anxiety of the right sort. That reminded me that I had forgotten to speak to Lupin about the letter I received from Mr. Mutlar senior. I broached the subject to Lupin in the evening, having first consulted Carrie. Lupin was riveted to the Financial Times as if he had been a born capitalist, and I said, "Pardon me a moment, Lupin. "How is it you have not been to the Mutlars any day this week?" Lupin answered, "I told you I cannot stand old Mutlar." I said, "Mr. Mutlar writes to me to say pretty plainly that he cannot stand you." Lupin said, "Well, I like his cheek in writing to you. I will find out if his father is still alive, and I will write to him a note complaining of his son, and I'll state pretty clearly that his son is a blithering idiot." I said, "Lupin, please moderate your expressions in the presence of your mother." Lupin said, "I'm very sorry, but there is no other expression one can apply to him. However, I'm determined not to enter his place again." I said, "You know, Lupin, he has forbidden you the house." Lupin replied, "Well, we won't split straws, it's all the same. Daisy is a trump and will wait for me 10 years if necessary." January the 5th. I can scarcely write the news. Mr. Perkupp told me my salary would be raised £100. I stood gaping for a moment, unable to realise it. I annually get £10 rise, and I thought it might be 15 or even 20. But £100 surpasses all belief. Carrie and I both rejoiced over our good fortune. Lupin came home in the evening in the utmost good spirits. I sent Sarah quietly round to the grocer's for a bottle of champagne, the same as we had before, Jackson Frère. It was opened at supper, and I said to Lupin, "This is to celebrate some good news I've received to-day." Lupin replied, "Hooray, Gov, and I have some good news also. A double event, eh?" I said, "My boy, as a result of 21 years' industry and strict attention to the interests of my superiors in office, I have been rewarded with promotion and a rise in salary of £100. Lupin gave 3 cheers, and we rapped the table furiously, which brought in Sarah to see what the matter was. Lupin ordered us to fill up again, and, addressing us upstanding, said, "Having been in the firm of Job, Cleanands, stock and shareholders a few weeks, and not having paid particular attention to the interests of my superiors in office, my governor, as a reward to me, allotted me £5 worth of shares in a really good thing. The result is, to-day, I have made £200. I said, "Lupin, you're joking." "No, Gov, it's the good old truth. Job, Cleanands put me on to chlorates." January the 21st. I am very much concerned at Lupin having started a pony trap. I said, "Lupin, are you justified in this outrageous extravagance?" Lupin replied, "Well, one must get to the city somehow. I've only hired it, and can give it up any time I like." I repeated my question, "Are you justified in this extravagance?" He replied, "Look here, Gov, excuse me saying so, but you're a bit out of date. It does not pay nowadays fiddling about over small things." I don't mean anything personal, Governor. My boss says if I take his tip and stick to big things, I can make big money. I said I thought the very idea of speculation most horrifying. Lupin said, "It is not speculation, it's a dead cert." I advised him at all events not to continue the pony and cart, but he replied, "I made £200 in one day. Now suppose I only make £200 in a month, or put it at £100 a month, which is ridiculously low, why that is £1,250 a year. What's a few pounds a week for a trap?" I did not pursue the subject further, beyond saying that I should feel glad when the autumn came and Lupin would be of age and responsible for his own debts. He answered, "My dear Gov, I promise you faithfully that I will never speculate with what I have not got. I shall only go on Job Cleanands' tips, and as he is in the know, it is pretty safe sailing." I felt somewhat relieved. Gowing called in the evening, and, to my surprise, informed me that, as he had made £10 by one of Lupin's tips, he intended asking us and the Cummings round next Saturday. Carrie and I said we would be delighted. January the 22nd. I don't generally lose my temper with servants, but I had to speak to Sarah rather sharply about a careless habit she has recently contracted of shaking the tablecloth after removing the breakfast things in a manner which causes all the crumbs to fall on the carpet, eventually to be trodden in. Sarah answered very rudely, "Oh, you're always complaining." I replied, "Indeed I am not. I spoke to you last week about walking all over the drawing-room carpet with a piece of yellow soap on the heel of your boot. She said, and you're always grumbling about your breakfast. I said, no, I am not, but I feel perfectly justified in complaining that I never can get a hard-boiled egg. The moment I crack the shell, it spurts all over the place, and I have spoken to you at least 50 times about it. She began to cry and make a scene, but fortunately my bus came by, so I had a good excuse for leaving her. Gowing left a message in the evening that we were not to forget next Saturday. Carrie amusingly said, as he has never asked any friends before, we are not likely to forget it. January the 23rd. I asked Lupin to try and change the hard brushes he had recently made me a present of for some softer ones, as my hairdresser tells me I ought not to brush my hair too much just now. January the 24th. The new chimney glass came home for the back drawing-room. Carrie arranged some fans very prettily on the top and on each side. It is an immense improvement to the room. January the 25th. We had just finished our tea, when who should come in but Cummings, who has not been here for over 3 weeks. I noticed he looked anything but well, so I said, "Well, Cummings, how are you? You look a little blue." He replied, "Yes, and I feel blue too." I said, "Why, what's the matter?" He said, "Oh, nothing, except that I've been on my back for a couple of weeks, that's all. At one time my doctor nearly gave me up, yet not a soul has come near me. No one has even taken the trouble to inquire whether I was alive or dead." I said, "This is the first I've heard of it. I have passed your house several nights and presumed you had company, as the rooms were so brilliantly lighted." Cummings replied, "No, the only company I have had was my wife, the doctor, and the landlady, the last named having turned out a perfect trump." "I wonder you did not see it in the paper. I know it was mentioned in the Bicycle News." I thought to cheer him up, and said, "Well, you're all right now." He replied, "That's not the question. The question is whether an illness does not enable you to discover who are your true friends." I said such an observation was unworthy of him. To make matters worse, in came Gowing, who gave Cummings a violent slap on the back and said, "Hullo, have you seen a ghost? You look scared to death, like Irving in Macbeth." I said, "Gently, Gowing, the poor fellow has been very ill." Gowing roared with laughter and said, "Yes, and you look it too." Cummings quietly said, "Yes, and I feel it too, not that I suppose you care." An awkward silence followed. Gowing said, "Never mind, Cummings, you and the missus come round to my place to-morrow, and it will cheer you up a bit, for we'll open a bottle of wine." January the 26th. An extraordinary thing happened. Carrie and I went round to Gowing's, as arranged, at 7:30. We knocked and rang several times without getting an answer. At last the latch was drawn and the door opened a little way, the chain still being up. A man in shirt-sleeves put his head through and said, "Who is it? What do you want?" I said, "Mr. Gowing, he's expecting us." The man said, as well as I could hear, owing to the yapping of a little dog, "I don't think he is. Mr. Gowing is not at home." I said, "He will be in directly." With that observation he slammed the door, leaving Carrie and me standing on the steps, with a cutting wind blowing round the corner. Carrie advised me to knock again. I did so, and then discovered for the first time that the knocker had been newly painted, and the paint had come off on my gloves, which were, in consequence, completely spoiled. I knocked at the door with my stick 2 or 3 times. The man opened the door, taking the chain off this time, and began abusing me. He said, "What do you mean by scratching the paint with your stick like that, spoiling the varnish? You ought to be ashamed of yourself." I said, "Pardon me, Mr. Gowing invited..." He interrupted and said, "I don't care for Mr. Gowing or any of his friends. This is my door, not Mr. Gowing's. There are people here besides Mr. Gowing." The impertinence of this man was nothing. I scarcely noticed it. It was so trivial in comparison with the scandalous conduct of Gowing. At this moment Cummings and his wife arrived. Cummings was very lame and leaning on a stick, but got up the steps and asked what the matter was. The man said Mr. Gowing said nothing about expecting anyone. All he said was that he had just received an invitation to Croydon, and he should not be back till Monday evening. He took his bag with him. With that he slammed the door again. I was too indignant with Gowing's conduct to say anything. Cummings looked white with rage, and as he descended the steps, struck his stick violently on the ground and said, "Scoundrel!" End of chapter. The Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith. Read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 15. Gowing explains his conduct. Lupin takes us for a drive, which we don't enjoy. Lupin introduces us to Mr. Murray Posh. February the 8th. It does seem hard that I cannot get good sausages for breakfast. They're either full of bread or spice or as red as beef. Still anxious about the £20 I invested last week by Lupin's advice. However, Cummings has done the same. February the 9th. Exactly a fortnight has passed, and I have neither seen nor heard from Gowing respecting his extraordinary conduct in asking us round to his house and then being out. In the evening, Carrie was engaged marking a half-dozen new collars I had purchased. I'll back Carrie's marking against anybody's. While I was drying them at the fire, and Carrie was rebuking me for scorching them, Cummings came in. He seemed quite well again, and chaffed us about marking the collars. I asked him if he had heard from Gowing, and he replied that he had not. I said I should not have believed that Gowing could have acted in such an ungentlemanly manner. Cummings said, "You are mild in your description of him. I think he acted like a cad." The words were scarcely out of his mouth when the door opened, and Gowing, putting in his head, said, "May I come in?" I said, "Certainly." Carrie said very pointedly, "Well, you are a stranger." Gowing said, "Yes, I've been on and off to Croydon during the last fortnight." I could see Cummings was boiling over, and eventually he tackled Gowing very strongly respecting his conduct last Saturday week. Gowing appeared surprised and said, "Why, I posted a letter to you in the morning announcing that the party was off, very much off." I said I never got it. Gowing, turning to Carrie, said, "I suppose letters sometimes miscarry, don't they, Mrs. Carrie?" Cummings sharply said, "This is not a time for joking. I had no notice of the party being put off. I told Pooter in my note to tell you, as I was in a hurry. However, I'll inquire at the post office, and we must meet again at my place." I added that I hoped he would be present at the next meeting. Carrie roared at this, and even Cummings could not help laughing. February the 10th, Sunday. Contrary to my wishes, Carrie allowed Lupin to persuade her to take her for a drive in the afternoon in his trap. I quite disapprove of driving on a Sunday, but I did not like to trust Carrie alone with Lupin, so I offered to go too. Lupin said, "Now, that is nice of you, Gov, but you won't mind sitting on the back seat of the cart." Lupin proceeded to put on a bright blue coat that seemed miles too large for him. Carrie said it wanted taking in considerably at the back. Lupin said, "Haven't you seen a box coat before? You can't drive in anything else." He may wear what he likes in the future, for I shall never drive with him again. His conduct was shocking. When we passed Highgate Archway, he tried to pass everything and everybody. He shouted to respectable people who were walking quietly in the road to get out of the way. He flicked the horse of an old man who was riding, causing it to rear. And as I had to ride backwards, I was compelled to face a gang of roughs in a donkey cart, whom Lupin had chaffed, and who turned and followed us for nearly a mile, bellowing, indulging in coarse jokes and laughter, to say nothing of occasionally pelting us with orange peel. Lupin's excuse, that the Prince of Wales would have to put up with the same sort of thing if he drove to the Derby, was of little consolation to either Carrie or myself. Frank Mutler called in the evening, and Lupin went out with him. February the 11th. Feeling a little concerned about Lupin, I mustered up courage to speak to Mr. Perkupp about him. Mr. Perkupp has always been most kind to me, so I told him everything, including yesterday's adventure. Mr. Perkupp kindly replied, "There is no necessity for you to be anxious, Mr. Pooter. It would be impossible for a son of such good parents to turn out erroneously. Remember, he is young and will soon get older. I wish we could find room for him in this firm. The advice of this good man takes loads off my mind." In the evening, Lupin came in. After our little supper, he said, "My dear parents, I have some news which I fear will affect you considerably." I felt a qualm come over me and said nothing. Lupin then said, "It may distress you, in fact, I'm sure it will, but this afternoon I have given up my pony and trap for ever." It may seem absurd, but I was so pleased I immediately opened a bottle of port. Gowing dropped in just in time, bringing with him a large sheet with a print of a tailless donkey, which he fastened against the wall. He then produced several separate tails, and we spent the remainder of the evening trying blindfolded to pin a tail on in the proper place. My sides positively ached with laughter when I went to bed. February 12th. In the evening I spoke to Lupin about his engagement with Daisy Mutlar. I asked if he had heard from her. He replied, "No, she promised that old windbag of a father of hers that she would not communicate with me." I see Frank Mutlar, of course. In fact, he said he might call again this evening. Frank called, but he said he could not stop, as he had a friend waiting outside for him named Murray Posh, adding he was quite a swell. Carrie asked Frank to bring him in. He was brought in, Gowing entering at the same time. Mr. Murray Posh was a tall, fat young man, and was evidently of a very nervous disposition. As he subsequently confessed, he would never go in a hansom cab, nor would he enter a four-wheeler until the driver had first got on the box with the reins in his hands. On being introduced, Gowing, with his usual want of tact, said, "Any relation to Posh's 3-shilling hats?" Mr. Posh replied, "Yes, but please understand I don't try on hats myself. I take no active part in the business." I replied, "I wish I had a business like it." Mr. Posh seemed pleased, and gave a long but most interesting history of the extraordinary difficulties in the manufacture of cheap hats. Murray Posh evidently knew Daisy Mutlar very intimately from the way he was talking of her, and Frank said to Lupin once laughingly, "If you don't look out, Posh will cut you out." When they had all gone, I referred to this flippant conversation, and Lupin said sarcastically, "A man who is jealous has no respect for himself. A man who would be jealous of an elephant like Murray Posh could only have contempt for himself. I know Daisy. She would wait 10 years for me, as I said before. In fact, if necessary, she would wait 20 years for me." End of chapter. The Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith, read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 16. We lose money over Lupin's advice as to investment, so does Cummings. Murray Posh engaged to Daisy Mutlar. February 18th. Carrie has several times recently called attention to the thinness of my hair at the top of my head, and recommended me to get it seen to. I was this morning trying to look at it by the aid of a small hand-glass, when somehow my elbow caught against the edge of the chest of drawers and knocked the glass out of my hand and smashed it. Carrie was in an awful way about it, as she is rather absurdly superstitious. To make matters worse, my large photograph in the drawing-room fell during the night and the glass cracked. Carrie said, "Mark my words, Charles, some misfortune is about to happen." I said, "Nonsense, dear." In the evening, Lupin arrived home early and seemed a little agitated. I said, "What's up, my boy?" He hesitated a good deal, and then said, "You know those Parachica chlorates I advised you to invest £20 in?" I replied, "Yes, they are all right, I trust." He replied, "Well, no, to the surprise of everybody, they have utterly collapsed." My breath was so completely taken away I could say nothing. Carrie looked at me and said, "What did I tell you?" Lupin, after a while, said, "However, you are specially fortunate. I received an early tip and sold out yours immediately, and was fortunate to get £2 for them. So you get something after all." I gave a sigh of relief. I said I was not so sanguine as to suppose, as you predicted, that I should get 6 or 8 times the amount of my investment. Still, a profit of £2 is a good percentage for such a short time. Lupin said quite irritably, "You don't understand. I sold your £20 shares for £2. You therefore lose £18 on the transaction, whereby Cummings and Gowing will lose the whole of theirs." February the 19th. Lupin, before going to town, said, "I'm very sorry about those parachica chlorates. It would not have happened if the boss, Job Cleanands, had been in town. Between ourselves, you must not be surprised if something goes wrong at our office. Job Cleanands has not been seen in the last few days, and it strikes me several people do want to see him, very particularly." In the evening, Lupin was just on the point of going out to avoid a collision with Gowing and Cummings, when the former entered the room without knocking, but with his usual trick of saying, "May I come in?" He entered, and, to the surprise of Lupin and myself, seemed to be in the very best of spirits. Neither Lupin nor I broached the subject to him, but he did so of his own accord. He said, "I say, those parachica chlorates have gone an awful smash. You're a nice one, Master Lupin. How much do you lose?" Lupin, to my utter astonishment, said, "Oh, I had nothing in them. There was some informality in my application. I forgot to enclose the cheque or something, and I didn't get any. The Gov loses £18. I said I quite understood you were in it, or nothing would have induced me to speculate. Lupin replied, "Well, it can't be helped. You must go double on the next tip." Before I could reply, Gowing said, "Well, I lose nothing, fortunately. From what I heard, I did not quite believe in them, so I persuaded Cummings to take my £15 worth, as he had more faith in them than I had." Lupin burst out laughing, and in the most unseemly manner said, "Alas, poor Cummings, he'll lose £35. At that moment there was a ring at the bell. Lupin said, "I don't want to meet Cummings." If he had gone out of the door, he would have met him in the passage, so as quickly as possible Lupin opened the parlour window and got out. Gowing jumped up suddenly, exclaiming, "I don't want to see him either," and before I could say a word he followed Lupin out of the window. For my own part, I was horrified to think that my own son and one of my most intimate friends should depart from the house like a couple of interrupted burglars. Poor Cummings was very upset, and naturally was very angry both with Lupin and Gowing. I pressed him to have a little whisky, and he replied he had given up whisky, but would like a little unsweetened, as he was advised it was the most healthy spirit. I had none in the house, but sent Sarah round to Lockwood's for some. February the 20th. The first thing that caught my eye on opening the Standard was "Great failure of stock and share dealers. Mr. Job Cleanands absconded." I handed it to Carrie, and she replied, "Oh, perhaps it's for Lupin's good. I never did think it a suitable situation for him." I thought the whole affair very shocking. Lupin came down to breakfast, and seeing he looked painfully distressed, I said, "We know the news, my dear boy, and feel very sorry for you." Lupin said, "How did you know? Who told you?" I handed him the Standard. He threw the paper down and said, "Oh, I don't care a button for that. I expected that, but I did not expect this." He then read a letter from Frank Mutlar, announcing in a cool manner that Daisy Mutlar is to be married next month to Murray Posh. I exclaimed, "Murray Posh? Is not that the very man Frank had the impudence to bring here last Tuesday week?" Lupin said, "Yes, the Posh's 3-shilling hats chap." We all then ate our breakfast in dead silence. In fact, I could eat nothing. I was not only too worried, but I cannot and will not eat cushion of bacon. If I cannot get streaky bacon, I will do without anything. When Lupin rose to go, I noticed a malicious smile creep over his face. I asked him what it meant. He replied, "Oh, only a little consolation. Still, it is a consolation. I have just remembered that, by my advice, Mr. Murray Posh has invested £600 in Parachika chlorates." End of chapter. The Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith. Read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 17. Marriage of Daisy Mutlar and Murray Posh. The dream of my life realised. Mr. Perkupp takes Lupin into the office. March the 20th. Today being the day on which Daisy Mutlar and Mr. Murray Posh are to be married, Lupin has gone with a friend to spend the day at Gravesend. Lupin has been much cut up over the affair, although he declares that he is glad it is off. I wish he would not go to so many music halls, but one dare not say anything to him about it. At the present moment he irritates me by singing all over the house some nonsense about "What's the matter with Gladstone? He's all right. What's the matter with Lupin? He's all right." I don't think either of them is. In the evening Gowing called, and the chief topic of conversation was Daisy's marriage to Murray Posh. I said I was glad the matter was at an end, as Daisy would only have made a fool of Lupin. Gowing, with his usual good taste, said, "Oh, Master Lupin can make a fool of himself without any assistance." Carrie very properly resented this, and Gowing had sufficient sense to say he was sorry. March the 21st. To-day I shall conclude my diary, for it is one of the happiest days of my life. My great dream of the last few weeks, in fact, of many years, has been realised. This morning came a letter from Mr. Perkupp asking me to take Lupin down to the office with me. I went to Lupin's room. Poor fellow, he seemed very pale, and said he had a bad headache. He had come back yesterday from Gravesend, where he spent part of the day in a small boat on the water, having been mad enough to neglect to take his overcoat with him. I showed him Mr. Perkupp's letter, and he got up as quickly as possible. I begged of him not to put on his fast-coloured clothes and ties, but to dress in something black or quiet-looking. Carrie was all of a tremble when she read the letter, and all she could keep on saying was, "Oh, I do hope it will be all right." For myself, I could scarcely eat any breakfast. Lupin came down dressed quietly and looking a perfect gentleman, except that his face was rather yellow. Carrie, by way of encouragement, said, "You do look nice, Lupin." Lupin replied, "Yes, it's a good make-up, isn't it? A regular, downright, respectable, funereal, first-class, city firm junior clerk." He laughed rather ironically. In the hall I heard a great noise, and also Lupin shouting to Sarah to fetch down his old hat. I went into the passage and found Lupin in a fury, kicking and smashing a new tall hat. I said, "Lupin, my boy, what are you doing? How wicked of you! Some poor fellow would be glad to have it." Lupin replied, I would not insult any poor fellow by giving it to him. When he had gone outside, I picked up the battered hat and saw inside Posh's patent. Poor Lupin, I can forgive him. It seemed hours before we reached the office. Mr. Perkupp sent for Lupin, who was with him nearly an hour. He returned, as I thought, crestfallen in appearance. I said, "Well, Lupin, how about Mr. Perkupp?" Lupin commenced his song, "What's the matter with Perkupp? He's all right." I felt instinctively my boy was engaged. I went to Mr. Perkupp, but I could not speak. He said, "Well, Mr. Pooter, what is it?" I must have looked a fool, for all I could say was, "Mr. Perkupp, you're a good man." He looked at me for a moment and said, "No, Mr. Pooter, you are the good man, and we'll see if we cannot get your son to follow such an excellent example." I said, "Mr. Perkupp, may I go home? I cannot work any more to-day." My good master shook my hand warmly as he nodded his head. It was as much as I could do to prevent myself from crying in the bus. In fact, I should have done so had my thoughts not been interrupted by Lupin, who was having a quarrel with a fat man in the bus, whom he accused of taking up too much room. In the evening, Carrie sent round for dear old friend Cummings and his wife, and also to Gowing. We all sat round the fire, and in a bottle of Jackson Frere which Sarah fetched from the grocer's, drank Lupin's health. I lay awake for hours thinking of the future. My boy in the same office as myself. We can go down together by the bus, come home together, and who knows but in the course of time he may take great interest in our little home, that he may help me to put a nail in here or a nail in there, or help his dear mother to hang a picture. In the summer he may help us in our little garden with the flowers and assist us to paint the stands and the pots. By the by, I must get in some more enamel paint. And this I thought over and over again, and 1,000 happy thoughts beside. I heard the clock strike 4, and soon after fell asleep, only to dream of 3 happy people, Lupin, dear Carrie, and myself. End of chapter. The Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith. Read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 20. Dinner at Franching's to meet Mr. Hardfur Huttle. May the 10th. Received a letter from Mr. Franching of Peckham, asking us to dine with him tonight at 7 o'clock to meet Mr. Hardfur Huttle, a very clever writer for the American papers. Franching apologised for the short notice, but said he had at the last moment been disappointed of 2 of his guests, and regarded us as old friends who would not mind filling up the gap. Carrie rather demurred at the invitation, but I explained to her that Franching was very well off and influential, and we could not afford to offend him. And we are sure to get a good dinner and a good glass of champagne. Which never agrees with you, Carrie replied sharply. I regarded Carrie's observation as unsaid. Mr. Franching asked us to wire a reply. As he had said nothing about dress in the letter, I wired back, "With pleasure, is it full dress?" And by leaving out our name, just got the message within the sixpence. Got back early to give time to dress, which we received a telegram instructing us to do. I wanted Carrie to meet me at Franching's house, but she would not do so, so I had to go home to fetch her. What a long journey it is from Holloway to Peckham. Why do people live such a long way off? Having to change buses, I allowed plenty of time, in fact too much, for we arrived at 20 minutes to 7, and Franching, so the servant said, had only just gone up to dress. However, he was down as the clock struck 7. He must have dressed very quickly. I must say it was quite a distinguished party, and although we did not know anybody personally, they all seemed to be quite swells. Franching had got a professional waiter, and evidently spared no expense. There were flowers on the table round some fairy lamps, and the effect, I must say, was exquisite. The wine was good, and there was plenty of champagne, concerning which Franching said he, himself, never wished to taste better. We were 10 in number, and a menu card to each. One lady said she always preserved the menu, and got the guests to write their names on the back. We all of us followed her example, except Mr. Huttle, who was of course the important guest. The dinner party consisted of Mr. Franching, Mr. Hardfur Huttle, Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Hillbutter, Mrs. Field, Mr. and Mrs. Purdick, Mr. Pratt, Mr. R. Kent, and last but not least, Mr. and Mrs. Charles Pooter. Franching said he was sorry he had no lady for me to take in to dinner. I replied that I preferred it, which I afterwards thought was a very uncomplimentary observation to make. I sat next to Mrs. Field at dinner. She seemed a well-informed lady, but was very deaf. It did not much matter, for Mr. Hardfur Huttle did all the talking. He is a marvellously intellectual man, and says things which, from other people, would seem quite alarming. How I wish I could remember even a quarter of his brilliant conversation. I made a few little reminding notes on the menu card. One observation struck me as being absolutely powerful, though not to my way of thinking, of course. Mrs. Purdick happened to say, "You are certainly unorthodox, Mr. Huttle." Mr. Huttle, with a peculiar expression, I can see it now, said in a slow, rich voice, "Mrs. Purdick, orthodox is a grandiloquent word implying sticking in the mud. If Columbus and Stephenson had been orthodox, there would neither have been the discovery of America nor the steam engine. There was quite a silence. It appeared to me that such teaching was absolutely dangerous, and yet I felt, in fact we must all have felt, there was no answer to the argument. A little later on, Mrs. Purdick, who is Franching's sister and also acted as hostess, rose from the table, and Mr. Huttle said, "Why, ladies, do you deprive us of your company so soon? Why not wait while we have our cigars?" The effect was electrical. The ladies, including Carrie, were in no way inclined to be deprived of Mr. Huttle's fascinating society, and immediately resumed their seats amid much laughter and a little chaff. Mr. Huttle said, "Well, that's a really good sign. You shall not be insulted by being called orthodox any longer." Mrs. Purdick, who seemed to be a bright and rather sharp woman, said, "Mr. Huttle, we will meet you half-way, that is, till you get half-way through your cigar. That, at all events, will be the happy medium." I shall never forget the effect of the words happy medium had upon him. He was brilliant and most daring in his interpretation of the words. He positively alarmed me. He said something like the following: "Happy medium, indeed. Do you know, happy medium are two words which mean miserable mediocrity. I say go first class or third, marry a duchess or her kitchen maid. The happy medium means respectability, and respectability means insipidness. Does it not, Mr. Pooter?" I was so taken aback by being personally appealed to that I could only bow apologetically and say I feared I was not competent to offer an opinion. Carrie was about to say something, but she was interrupted, for which I was rather pleased, for she is not clever at argument, and one has to be extra clever to discuss a subject with a man like Mr. Huttle. He continued with an amazing eloquence that made his unwelcome opinions positively convincing. The happy medium is nothing more or less than a vulgar half-measure. A man who loves champagne and, finding a pint too little, fears to face a whole bottle and has recourse to an imperial pint, which will never build a Brooklyn Bridge or an Eiffel Tower. No, he is half-hearted, he is a half-measure. Respectable, in fact, a happy medium, and will spend the rest of his days in suburban villa with a stucco column portico resembling a four-post bedstead. We all laughed. That sort of thing, continued Mr. Huttle, belongs to a soft man with a soft beard, with a soft head, with a made tie that hooks on. This seemed rather personal, and twice I caught myself looking in the glass of the chiffonnier, for I had on a tie that hooked on, and why not? If these remarks were not personal, they were rather careless, and so were some of his subsequent observations, which must have made both Mr. Franching and his guests rather uncomfortable. I don't think Mr. Huttle meant to be personal, for he added, "We don't know that class here in this country, but we do in America, and I've no use for them." Franching several times suggested that the wine should be passed round the table, which Mr. Huttle did not heed, but continued as if he were giving a lecture. "What we want in America is your homes. We live on wheels. Your simple, quiet life and home, Mr. Franching, are charming. No display, no pretension. You make no difference in your dinner, I dare say, when you sit down by yourself and when you invite us. You have your own personal attendant, no hired waiter to breathe on the back of your head." I saw Franching palpably wince at this. Mr. Huttle continued, "Just a small dinner with a few good things such as you have this evening. You don't insult your guests by sending to the grocer for champagne at 6 shillings a bottle." I could not help thinking of Jackson Frere at 3 and 6. "In fact," said Mr. Huttle, "a man is little less than a murderer who does. That is the province of the milksop who wastes his evening at home playing dominoes with his wife. I've heard of these people. We don't want them at this table. Our party is well selected. We've no use for deaf old women who cannot follow intellectual conversation." All our eyes were turned to Mrs. Field, who, fortunately, being deaf, did not hear his remarks, but continued smiling approval. "We have no representative at Mr. Franching's table," said Mr. Huttle, "of the unenlightened, frivolous matron who goes to a second-class dance at Bayswater and fancies she is in society. Society does not know her, it has no use for her." Mr. Huttle paused for a moment, and the opportunity was afforded for the ladies to rise. I asked Mr. Franching quietly to excuse me, as I did not wish to miss the last train, which we very nearly did, by the by, through Carrie having mislaid the little cloth cricket cap which she wears when we go out. It was very late when Carrie and I got home, but on entering the sitting-room I said, "Carrie, what do you think of Mr. Hardfur Huttle?" She simply answered, "How like Lupin!" The same idea occurred to me in the train. The comparison kept me awake half the night. Mr. Huttle was, of course, an older and more influential man, but he was like Lupin, and it made me think how dangerous Lupin would be if he were older and more influential. I feel proud to think Lupin does resemble Mr. Huttle in some ways. Lupin, like Mr. Huttle, has original and sometimes wonderful ideas. But it is those ideas that are so dangerous. They make men extremely rich or extremely poor. They make or break men. I always feel people are happier who live a simple, unsophisticated life. I believe I am happy because I am not ambitious. Somehow I feel that Lupin, since he has been with Mr. Perkupp, has become content to settle down and follow the footsteps of his father. This is a comfort. End of chapter. The Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith. Read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 21. Lupin is discharged. We are in great trouble. Lupin gets engaged elsewhere at a handsome salary. May the 13th. A terrible misfortune has happened. Lupin is discharged from Mr. Perkupp's office, and I scarcely know how I am writing my diary. I was away from the office last Sat, the first time I have been absent through illness for 20 years. I believe I was poisoned by some lobster. Mr. Perkupp was also absent, as fate would have it, and our most valued customer, Mr. Crowbillon, went to the office in a rage and withdrew his custom. My boy Lupin not only had the assurance to receive him, but recommended him the firm of Gilterson, Sons and Co. Limited. In my own humble judgment, and though I have to say it against my own son, this seems an act of treachery. This morning I received a letter from Perkupp informing me that Lupin's services are no longer required, and an interview with me is desired at 11 o'clock. I went down to the office with an aching heart, dreading an interview with Mr. Perkupp, with whom I have never had a word. I saw nothing of Lupin in the morning. He had not got up when it was time for me to leave, and Carrie said I should do no good by disturbing him. My mind wandered so at the office that I could not do my work properly. As I expected, I was sent for by Mr. Perkupp, and the following conversation ensued as nearly as I can remember it. Mr. Perkupp said, "Good morning, Mr. Pooter. This is a very serious business. I am not referring so much to the dismissal of your son, for I knew we should have to part sooner or later. I am the head of this old, influential and much respected firm, and when I consider the time has come to revolutionise the business, I will do it myself." I could see my good master was somewhat affected, and I said, "I hope so, sir. You do not imagine that I have in any way countenanced my son's unwarrantable interference." Mr. Perkupp rose from his seat and took my hand, and said, "Mr. Pooter, I would as soon suspect myself as suspect you." I was so agitated that, in the confusion, to show my gratitude, I very nearly called him a grand old man. Fortunately, I checked myself in time, and said he was a grand old master. I was so unaccountable for my actions that I sat down, leaving him standing. Of course, I at once rose, but Mr. Perkupp bade me sit down, which I was very pleased to do. Mr. Perkupp, resuming, said, "You will understand, Mr. Pooter, that the high-standing nature of our firm will not admit of our bending to anybody. If Mr. Crowbillon chooses to put his work in other hands, I may add less experienced hands, it is not for us to bend and beg back his custom." "You shall not do it, sir," I said with indignation. "Exactly," replied Mr. Perkupp, "I shall not do it. But I was thinking this, Mr. Pooter. Mr. Crowbillon is our most valued client, and I will even confess, for I know this will not go beyond ourselves, that we cannot afford very well to lose him, especially in these times, which are not of the brightest. Now, I fancy you can be of service." I replied, "Mr. Perkupp, I will work day and night to serve you." Mr. Perkupp said, "I know you will. Now, what I should like you to do is this. You yourself might write to Mr. Crowbillon. You must not, of course, lead him to suppose I know anything about your doing so, and explain to him that your son was only taken on as a clerk, quite an inexperienced one, in fact, out of the respect the firm had for you, Mr. Pooter. This is, of course, a fact. I don't suggest you should speak in too strong terms of your own son's conduct, but I may add that, had he been a son of mine, I should have condemned his interference with no measured terms. That I leave to you. I think the result will be that Mr. Crowbillon will see the force of the foolish step he has taken, and our firm will neither suffer in dignity nor in pocket." I could not help thinking what a noble gentleman Mr. Perkupp is. His manners and his way of speaking seemed to almost thrill one with respect. I said, "Would you like to see the letter before I send it?" Mr. Perkupp said, "Oh no, I'd better not. I am supposed to know nothing about it, and I have every confidence in you. You must write the letter carefully. We are not very busy. You had better take the morning to-morrow, or the whole day if you like. I shall be here myself all day to-morrow, in fact all of the week, in case Mr. Crowbillon should call." I went home a little more cheerful, but I left word with Sarah that I could not see either Gowing or Cummings, nor in fact anybody, if they called in the evening. Lupin came into the parlour for a moment with a new hat on, and asked my opinion of it. I said I was not in the mood to judge of hats, and I did not think he was in a position to buy a new one. Lupin replied carelessly, "I didn't buy it, it was a present." I have such terrible suspicions of Lupin now that I scarcely like to ask him questions, as I dread the answers so. However, he saved me the trouble. He said, "I met a friend, an old friend, that I did not quite think a friend at the time, but it's all right, as he wisely said, all is fair in love and war, and there was no reason why we should not be friends still. He's a jolly, good, all-round sort of fellow, and very different stamp from that inflated fool of a Perkupp." I said, "Hush, Lupin, do not, pray, add insult to injury." Lupin said, "What do you mean by injury?" "I repeat, I have done no injury. Crowbillon is simply tired of a stagnant stick-in-the-mud firm, and made the change of his own account. I simply recommended the new firm as a matter of biz, good old biz." I said quietly, "I don't understand your slang, and at my time of life have no desire to learn it. So, Lupin, my boy, let us change the subject. I will, if it please you, try and be interested in your new hat adventure." Lupin said, "Oh, there's nothing much about it, except I have not once seen him since his marriage, and he said he was very pleased to see me, and hoped we should be friends. I stood a drink to cement the friendship, and he stood me a new hat, one of his own." I said, rather wearily, "But you have not told me your old friend's name." Lupin said, with affected carelessness, "Oh, didn't I? Well, I will. It was Murray Posh." Lupin came down late, and seeing me at home all the morning, asked the reason of it. Carrie and I both agreed it was better to say nothing to him about the letter I was writing, so I evaded the question. Lupin went out, saying he was going to lunch with Murray Posh in the City. I said I hoped Mr. Posh would provide him with a berth. Lupin went out laughing, saying, "I don't mind wearing Posh's one-priced hats, but I'm not going to sell them." Poor boy, I fear he is perfectly hopeless. It took me nearly the whole day to write to Mr. Crowbillon. Once or twice I asked Carrie for suggestions, and, although it seems ungrateful, her suggestions were none of them to the point, while one or two were absolutely idiotic. Of course I did not tell her so. I got the letter off and took it down to the office for Mr. Perkupp to see, but he again repeated that he could trust me. Gowing called in the evening, and I was obliged to tell him about Lupin and Mr. Perkupp, and, to my surprise, he was quite inclined to side with Lupin. Carrie joined in and said she thought I was taking much too melancholy a view of it. Gowing produced a pint sample bottle of Madeira, which had been given to him, which he said would get rid of the blues. I dare say it would have done so if there had been more of it, but as Gowing helped himself to 3 glasses, it did not leave much for Carrie and me to get rid of the blues with. May the 15th, a day of great anxiety, for I expected every moment a letter from Mr. Crowbillon. 2 letters came in the evening, one for me, with Crowbillon Hall printed in large gold and red letters on the back of the envelope, the other for Lupin, which I felt inclined to open and read, as it had Gylterson, Sons and Co. Limited, which was the recommended firm. I trembled as I opened Mr. Crowbillon's letter. I wrote him 16 pages, closely written. He wrote me less than 16 lines. His letter was, "Sir, I totally disagree with you. Your son, in the course of 5 minutes' conversation, displayed more intelligence than your firm has done during the last 5 years. Yours faithfully, Gilbert E. Gillam O. Crowbillon." What am I to do? Here is a letter that I dare not show to Mr. Perkupp, and would not show to Lupin for anything. The crisis had yet to come, for Lupin arrived, and, opening his letter, showed a cheque for £25 as a commission for the recommendation of Mr. Crowbillon, whose custom to Mr. Perkupp is evidently lost for ever. Cummings and Gowing both called, and both took Lupin's part. Cummings went so far as to say that Lupin would make a name yet. I suppose I was melancholy, for I could only ask, "Yes, but what sort of a name?" May the 16th. I told Mr. Perkupp the contents of the letter in a modified form, but Mr. Perkupp said, "Pray don't discuss the matter. It is at an end. Your son will bring his punishment upon himself." I went home in the evening thinking of the hopeless future of Lupin. I found him in the most extravagant spirits and in evening dress. He threw a letter on the table for me to read. To my amazement, I read that Gylterson and Sons had absolutely engaged Lupin at a salary of £200 a year, with other advantages. I read the letter through 3 times and thought it must have been for me, but there it was, Lupin Pooter, plain enough. I was silent. Lupin said, "What price Perkupp now?" "You take my tip, Gov. Off with Perkupp, and freeze on to Gylterson, the firm of the future. Perkupp's firm, the stagnant dummies, have been standing still for years, and now are moving back. I want to go on. In fact, I must go off, as I am dining with the Murray Poshes tonight." In the exuberance of his spirits, he hit his hat with a stick and gave a loud war whoop, jumped over a chair, and took the liberty of rumpling my hair all over my forehead, and bounced out of the room, giving me no chance of reminding him of his age and the respect which was due to his parent. Gowing and Cummings came in the evening, and positively cheered me up with congratulations respecting Lupin. Gowing said, "I always said he would get on, and take my word, he has more in his head than we 3 put together." Carrie said, "He's a second Hardfur Huttle." End of chapter. The Diary of a Nobody, by George and Weedon Grossmith. Read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 22. Master Percy Edgar Smith James. Mrs. James of Sutton visits us again and introduces spiritual séances. May the 26th, Sunday. We went to Sutton after dinner to have meat tea with Mr. and Mrs. James. I had no appetite, having dined well at 2, and the entire evening was spoilt by little Percy, their only son, who seems to me to be an utterly spoiled child. 2 or 3 times he came up to me and deliberately kicked my shins. He hurt me once so much that the tears came into my eyes. I gently remonstrated with him, and Mrs. James said, "Please don't scold him. I do not believe in being too severe with young children. You spoil their character." Little Percy set up a deafening yell here, and when Carrie tried to pacify him, he slapped her face. I was so annoyed, I said, "This is not my idea of bringing up children, Mrs. James." Mrs. James said, "People have different ideas of bringing up children. Even your son Lupin is not the standard of perfection." And Mr. Mazzini, an Italian, I fancy, here took Percy in his lap. The child wriggled and kicked and broke away from Mr. Mazzini, saying, "I don't like you. You've got a dirty face." A very nice gentleman, Mr. Burke's spooner, took the child by the wrist and said, "Come here, dear, and listen to this." He detached his chronometer from the chain and made his watch strike 6. To our horror, the child snatched it from his hand and bounced it down upon the ground like one would a ball. Mr. Birks Spooner was most amiable, and said he could easily get a new glass put in, and did not suppose the works were damaged. To show you how people's opinions differ, Carrie said the child was bad-tempered, but it made up for that defect by its looks, for it was, in her mind, an unquestionably beautiful child. I may be wrong, but I do not think I have seen a much uglier child myself. That is my opinion. May the 30th. I don't know why it is, but I never anticipate with any pleasure the visits to our house of Mrs. James of Sutton. She is coming again to stay for a few days. I said to Carrie this morning, as I was leaving, "I wish, dear Carrie, I could like Mrs. James better than I do." Carrie said, "So do I, dear. But as for years I've had to put up with Mr. Gowing, who is vulgar, and Mr. Cummings, who is kind but most uninteresting, I am sure, dear, you won't mind the occasional visits of Mrs. James, who has more intellect in her little finger than both your friends have in their entire bodies." I was so entirely taken aback by this onslaught on my two dear old friends, I could say nothing, and as I heard the bus coming, I left with a hurried kiss. A little too hurried, perhaps, for my upper lip came in contact with Carrie's teeth and slightly cut it. It was quite painful for an hour afterwards. When I came home in the evening, I found Carrie buried in a book on spiritualism, called There Is No Birth, by Florence Singleyet. I need scarcely say the book was sent her to read by Mrs. James of Sutton. As she had not a word to say outside her book, I spent the rest of the evening altering the stair carpets, which are beginning to show signs of wear at the edges. Mrs. James arrived and, as usual, in the evening took the entire management of everything. Finding that she and Carrie were making some preparations for table-turning, I thought it time really to put my foot down. I have always had the greatest contempt for such nonsense, and put an end to it years ago when Carrie at our old house used to have séances every night with poor Mrs. Fusters, who is now dead. If I could see any use in it, I would not care. As I stopped it in the days gone by, I determined to do so now. I said, "I am very sorry, Mrs. James, but I totally disapprove of it, apart from the fact that I received my old friends on this evening." Mrs. James said, "Do you mean to say you haven't read There Is No Birth?" I said no, and I have no intention of doing so. Mrs. James seemed surprised, and said, "All the world is going mad over the book." I responded, rather cleverly, "Let it. There will be one sane man in it at all events." Mrs. James said she thought I was very unkind, and if people were all as prejudiced as I was, there would never have been the electric telegraph or the telephone. I said that was quite a different thing. Mrs. James said sharply, "In what way, pray, in what way?" I said, "In many ways." Mrs. James said, "Well, mention one way." I replied quietly, "Pardon me, Mrs. James, I decline to discuss the matter. I am not interested in it." Sarah, at this moment, opened the door and showed in Cummings, for which I was thankful, for I felt it would put a stop to this foolish table-turning. But I was entirely mistaken, for, on the subject being opened again, Cummings said he was most interested in spiritualism, although he was bound to confess he did not believe much in it. Still, he was willing to be convinced. I firmly declined to take any part in it, with the result that my presence was ignored. I left the three sitting in the parlour at a small round table which they had taken out of the drawing-room. I walked into the hall with the ultimate intention of taking a little stroll. As I opened the door, who should come in but Gowing. On hearing what was going on, he proposed that we should join the circle, and he would go into a trance. He added that he knew a few things about old Cummings, and would invent a few about Mrs. James. Knowing how dangerous Gowing is, I declined to let him take part in any such foolish performance. Sarah asked me if she could go out for half an hour, and I gave her permission, thinking it would be more comfortable to sit with Gowing in the kitchen than in the cold drawing-room. We talked a good deal about Lupin and Mr. and Mrs. Murray Posh, with whom he is as usual spending the evening. Gowing said, "I say, it wouldn't be a bad thing for Lupin if old Posh kicked the bucket." My heart gave a leap of horror, and I rebuked Gowing very sternly for joking on such a subject. I lay awake half the night thinking of it. The other half was spent in nightmares on the same subject. May 31st. I wrote a stern letter to the laundress. I was rather pleased with the letter, for I thought it very satirical. I said, "You have returned the handkerchiefs without the colour. Perhaps you will return either the colour or the value of the handkerchiefs." I shall be rather curious to know what she will have to say. More table-turning in the evening. Carrie said last night was, in a measure, successful, and they ought to sit again. Cummings came in and seemed interested. I had the gas lighted in the drawing-room, got the steps, and repaired the cornice, which has been a bit of an eyesore to me. In a fit of unthinkingness, if I may use such an expression, I gave the floor over the parlour where the séance was taking place 2 loud raps with the hammer. I felt sorry afterwards, for it was a sort of ridiculous, foolhardy thing that Gowing or Lupin would have done. However, they never even referred to it, but Carrie declared that a message came through the table to her of a wonderful description, concerning someone whom she and I knew years ago, and who was quite unknown to the others. When we went to bed, Carrie asked me as a favour to sit to-morrow night to oblige her. She said it seemed rather unkind and unsociable on my part. I promised I would sit once. June 1st. I sat reluctantly at the table in the evening, and I am bound to admit some curious things happened. I contend they were coincidences, but they were curious. For instance, the table kept tilting towards me, which Carrie construed as a desire that I should ask the spirit a question. I obeyed the rules, and I asked the spirit, who said her name was Lena, if she could tell me the name of an old aunt of whom I was thinking, and whom we used to call Aunt Maggie. The table spelled out C-A-T. We could make nothing of it, till I suddenly remembered that her second name was Catherine, which it was evidently trying to spell. I don't think even Carrie knew this, but if she did, she would never cheat. I must admit it was curious. Several other things happened, and I consented to sit at another séance on Monday. June 3rd. The laundress called and said she was very sorry about the handkerchiefs, and returned 9d. I said, as the colour was completely washed out and the handkerchiefs quite spoiled, 9d was not enough. Carrie replied that the 2 handkerchiefs originally only cost 6d, for she remembered buying them at a sale at the Holloway Bon Marché. In that case, I insisted that 3d should be returned to the laundress. Lupin has gone to stay with the Poshes for a few days. I must say I feel very uncomfortable about it. Carrie said I was ridiculous to worry about it. Mr. Posh was very fond of Lupin, who, after all, was only a mere boy. In the evening we had another séance, which in some respects was very remarkable, although the first part of it was a little doubtful. Gowing called, as well as Cummings, and begged to be allowed to join the circle. I wanted to object, but Mrs. James, who appears a good medium, that is, if there is anything in it at all, thought there might be a little more spirit power if Gowing joined. So the 5 of us sat down. The moment I turned out the gas, and almost before I could get my hands on the table, it rocked violently and tilted, and began moving quickly across the room. Gowing shouted out, "Way-oh, steady, lad, steady!" I told Gowing if he could not behave himself, I should light the gas, and put an end to the séance. To tell the truth, I thought Gowing was playing tricks, and I hinted as much. But Mrs. James said she had often seen the table go right off the ground. The spirit Lena came again and said, "Warn," 3 or 4 times, and declined to explain. Mrs. James said Lena was stubborn sometimes. She often behaved like that, and the best thing to do was to send her away. She then hit the table sharply and said, "Go away, Lena, you are disagreeable, go away." I should think we sat nearly 3/4 of an hour with nothing happening. My hands felt quite cold, and I suggested we should stop the séance. Carrie and Mrs. James, as well as Cummings, would not agree to it. It was about 10 minutes' time there was something tilting towards me. I gave the alphabet, and it spelled out S-P-O-O-F. As I have heard both Gowing and Lupin use the word, and as I could hear Gowing silently laughing, I directly accused him of pushing the table. He denied it, but I regret to say I did not believe him. Gowing said, "Perhaps it means spook or ghost." I said, "You know it doesn't mean anything of the sort." Gowing said, "Oh, very well, I'm sorry I spook," and he rose from the table. No one took any notice of the stupid joke, and Mrs. James suggested he should sit out for a while. Gowing consented and sat in the arm-chair. The table began to move again, and we might have had a wonderful séance, but for Gowing's stupid interruptions. In answer to the alphabet from Carrie, the table spelt N-I-P-U-L, then the W-A-R-N 3 times. We could not think what it meant till Cummings pointed out that N-I-P-U-L was Lupin spelled backwards. This was quite exciting. Carrie was particularly excited, and said she hoped nothing horrible was going to happen. Mrs. James asked if Lena was the spirit, and the table replied firmly no, and the spirit would not give his or her name. We then had the message N-I-P-U-L will be very rich. Carrie said she felt quite relieved, but the word warn was again spelled out. The table then began to oscillate violently, and in reply to Mrs. James, who spoke very softly to the table, the spirit began to spell its name. It first spelled D-R-I-N-K. Gowing here said, that's more in my line." I asked him to be quiet, as the name might not be completed. The table then spelt W-A-T-E-R. Gowing here interrupted again and said, that's not in my line. Outside if you like, but not inside." Carrie appealed to him to be quiet. The table then spelled Captain, and Mrs. James startled us by crying out, "Captain Drinkwater, a very old friend of my father's, who has been dead some years." This was more interesting, and I could not help thinking that after all there must be something in spiritualism. Mrs. James asked the spirit to interpret the meaning of the word warn as applied to N-I-P-U-L. The alphabet was given again, and we got the word B-O-S-H. Gowing here muttered, "So it is." Mrs. James said she did not think the spirit meant that, as Captain Drinkwater was a perfect gentleman, and would never have used the word in answer to a lady's question. Accordingly, the alphabet was given again. This time the table spelled distinctly P-O-S-H. We all thought of Mrs. Murray Posh and Lupin. Carrie was getting a little distressed, and as it was getting late, we broke up the circle. We arranged to have one more to-morrow, as it will be Mrs. James' last night in town. We also determined not to have Gowing present. Cummings, before leaving, said it was certainly interesting, but he wished the spirits would say something about him. June 4th. Quite looking forward to the séance this evening. Was thinking of it all day at the office. Just as we sat down at the table, we were annoyed by Gowing entering without knocking. He said, "I'm not going to stop, but I have brought with me a sealed envelope, which I know I can trust with Mrs. Pooter. In that sealed envelope is a strip of paper on which I have asked a simple question. If the spirits can answer that question, I will believe in spiritualism." I ventured the expression that it might be impossible. Mrs. James said, "Oh no, it is of common occurrence for the spirits to answer questions under such conditions, and even for them to write on locked slates. It is quite worth trying. If Lena is in a good temper, she is certain to do it." Gowing said, "All right, then I shall be a firm believer. I shall perhaps drop in about 9:30 or 10 and hear the result." He then left, and we sat a long time. Cummings wanted to know something about some undertaking in which he was concerned, but he could get no answer of any description whatever, at which he said he was very disappointed and was afraid there was not much in table-turning after all. I thought this rather selfish of him. The séance was very similar to the one last night, almost the same, in fact. So we turned to the letter. Lena took a long time answering the question, but eventually spelt out roses, lilies and cows. There was a great rocking of the table at this time, and Mrs. James said, "If that is Captain Drinkwater, let us ask him the answer as well." It was the spirit of the captain, and, most singular, he gave the same identical answer: roses, lilies and cows. I cannot describe the agitation with which Carrie broke the seal, or the disappointment we felt on reading the question, to which the answer was so inappropriate. The question was, "What's old Pooter's age?" This quite decided me. As I had put my foot down on spiritualism years ago, so I would again. I'm pretty easy-going as a rule, but I can be extremely firm when driven to it. I said slowly, as I turned up the gas, "This is the last of this nonsense that shall ever take place under my roof. I regret I permitted myself to be a party to such tomfoolery. If there is anything in it, which I doubt, it is nothing of any good, and I won't have it again. That is enough." Mrs. James said, "I think, Mr. Pooter, you are rather overstepping." I said, "Hush, madam. I am master of this house. Please understand that." Mrs. James made an observation which I sincerely hope I was mistaken in. I was in such a rage I could not quite catch what she said. But if I thought she said what it sounded like, she should never enter the house again. End of chapter. The Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith. Read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 23. Lupin leaves us. We dine at his new apartments and hear some extraordinary information respecting the wealth of Mr. Murray Posh. Meet Miss Lilian Posh. Am sent for by Mr. Hardfur Little. Important. July 1st. I find, on looking over my diary, nothing of any consequence has taken place during the last month. To-day we lose Lupin, who has taken furnished apartments at Bayswater, near his friends Mr. and Mrs. Murray Posh, at 2 guineas a week. I think this is most extravagant of him, as it is half his salary. Lupin says one never loses by a good address, and, to use his own expression, Brickfield Terrace is a bit off. Whether he means it is far off, I do not know. I have long since given up trying to understand his curious expressions. I said the neighbourhood had always been good enough for his parents. His reply was, "It is no question of being good or bad. There is no money in it, and I am not going to rot away my life in the suburbs." We are sorry to lose him, but perhaps he will get on better by himself, and there may be some truth in his remark that an old and a young horse can't pull together in the same cart. Gowing called and said that the house seemed quite peaceful and like old times. He liked Master Lupin very well, but he occasionally suffered from what he could not help, youth. July 2nd, Cummings called, looked very pale, and said he had been very ill again, and of course not a single friend had been near him. Carrie said she had never heard of it, whereupon he threw down a copy of the Bicycle News on the table with the following paragraph: "We regret to hear that favourite old roadster Mr. Cummings, Long Cummings, has met with what might have been a serious accident in Rye Lane. A mischievous boy threw a stick between the spokes of one of the back wheels, and the machine overturned, bringing our brother tricyclist heaving to the ground. Fortunately he was more frightened than hurt, but we missed his merry face at the dinner at Chingford, where they turned up in good numbers. Long Cummings' health was proposed by our popular vice, Mr. Westrop, the prince of bicyclists, who, in his happiest vein, said it was a case of Cummings through the Rye, but fortunately there was more weal than woe, a joke which created roars of laughter. We all said we were very sorry, and pressed Cummings to stay to supper. Cummings said it was like old times being without Lupin, and he was much better away." July 3rd, Sunday. In the afternoon, as I was looking out of the parlour window, which was open, a grand trap, driven by a lady with a gentleman seated by the side of her, stopped at our door. Not wishing to be seen, I withdrew my head very quickly, knocking the back of it violently against the sharp edge of the window sash. I was nearly stunned. There was a loud double knock at the front door. Carrie rushed out of the parlour upstairs to her room, and I followed, as Carrie thought it was Mr. Perkupp. I thought it was Mr. Franching. I whispered to Sarah over the banisters, "Show them into the drawing-room." Sarah said as the shutters were not open, the room would smell musty. There was another loud rat-tat. I whispered then, "Show them into the parlour and say Mr. Pooter will be down directly." I changed my coat, but could not see to do my hair, as Carrie was occupying the glass. Sarah came up and said it was Mrs. Murray Posh and Mr. Lupin. This was quite a relief. I went down with Carrie, and Lupin met me with the remark, "I say, what did you run away from the window for? Did we frighten you?" I foolishly said, "What window?" Lupin said, "Oh, you know. Shut it. You looked as if you were playing at Punch and Judy." On Carrie asking if she could offer them anything, Lupin said, "Oh, I think Daisy will take on a cup of tea. I can do with a B&S." I said, "I'm afraid we have no soda." Lupin said, "Don't bother about that. You just trip out and hold the horse. I don't think Sarah understands it." They stayed a very short time, and as they were leaving, Lupin said, "I want you both to come and dine with me next Wednesday and see my new place. Mr. and Mrs. Murray Posh, Miss Posh, Murray's sister, are coming. 8 o'clock sharp? No one else?" I said we did not pretend to be fashionable people, and would like the dinner earlier, as it made it so late before we got home. Lupin said, "Rats! You must get used to it. If it comes to that, Daisy and I can drive you home." We promised to go, but I must say in my simple mind the familiar way in which Mrs. Posh and Lupin addressed each other is reprehensible. Anybody would think they had been children together. I certainly should object to a 6 months' acquaintance calling my wife Carrie and driving out with her. July 4th. Lupin's rooms looked very nice, but the dinner was, I thought, a little too grand, especially as he commenced with champagne straight off. I also think Lupin might have told us that he and Mr. and Mrs. Murray Posh and Miss Posh were going to put on full evening dress. Knowing that the dinner was only for 6, we never dreamed it would be a full dress affair. I had no appetite. It was quite 20 minutes past 8 before we sat down to dinner. At 6 I could have eaten a hearty meal. I had a bit of bread and butter at that hour, feeling famished, and I expect that partly spoiled my appetite. We were introduced to Miss Posh, whom Lupin called Lily Girl, as if he had known her all his life. She was very tall, rather plain, and I thought she was a little painted around the eyes. I hope I am wrong, but she had such fair hair, and yet her eyebrows were black. She looked about 30. I did not like the way she kept giggling and giving Lupin smacks and pinching him. Then her laugh was a sort of scream that went right through my ears, all the more irritating because there was nothing to laugh at. In fact, Carrie and I were not at all prepossessed with her. They all smoked cigarettes after dinner, including Miss Posh, who startled Carrie by saying, "Don't you smoke, dear?" I answered for Carrie and said, "Mrs. Charles Pooter has not arrived at it yet." Whereupon Miss Posh gave one of her piercing laughs again. Mrs. Posh sang a dozen songs at least, and I can only repeat what I have said before, she does not sing in tune. But Lupin sat by the side of the piano, gazing into her eyes the whole time. If I had been Mr. Posh, I think I should have had something to say about it. Mr. Posh made himself very agreeable to us, and eventually sent us home in his carriage, which I thought most kind. He is evidently very rich, for Mrs. Posh had on some beautiful jewellery. She told Carrie her necklace, which her husband gave her as a birthday present, alone cost £300. Mr. Posh said he had a great belief in Lupin, and thought he would make rapid way in the world. I could not help thinking of the £600 Mr. Posh lost over the Parachika chlorids through Lupin's advice. During the evening I had an opportunity to speak to Lupin, and expressed a hope that Mr. Posh was not living beyond his means. Lupin sneered and said Mr. Posh was worth thousands. Posh's one-price hat was a household word in Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, and all the big towns throughout England. Lupin further informed me that Mr. Posh was opening branch establishments at New York, Sydney and Melbourne, and was negotiating for Kimberley and Johannesburg. I said I was pleased to hear it. Lupin said, "Why, he has settled over £10,000 on Daisy, and the same amount on Lily Girl. If at any time I wanted a little capital, he would put up a couple of thou at a day's notice, and could buy up Perkupp's firm over his head at any moment with ready cash." On the way home in the carriage, for the first time in my life, I was inclined to indulge in the radical thought that money was not properly divided. On arriving home at 11:15, we found a hansom cab which had been waiting for me for 2 hours with a letter. Sarah said she did not know what to do, as we had not left the address where we had gone. I trembled as I opened the letter, fearing it was some bad news about Mr. Perkupp. The note was: "Dear Mr. Pooter, come down to the Victoria Hotel without delay. Important. Yours truly, Hardfur Huttle." I asked the cabman if it was too late. The cabman replied that it was not, for his instructions were, if I happened to be out, he was to wait till I came home. I felt very tired, and really wanted to go to bed. I reached the hotel at midnight. I apologised for being so late, but Mr. Huttle said, "Not at all. Come and have a few oysters." I feel my heart beating as I write these words. To be brief, Mr. Huttle said he had a rich American friend who wanted to do something large in our line of business, and that Mr. Franching had mentioned my name to him. We talked over the matter. If by any happy chance the result be successful, I can more than compensate my dear master for the loss of Mr. Crowbillon's custom. Mr. Huttle had previously said, "The glorious 4th is a lucky day for America, and as it has not yet struck 12, we will celebrate it with a glass of the best wine to be had in the place, and drink good luck to our bit of business. I fervently hope it will bring good luck to us all." It was 2 o'clock when I got home, although I was so tired I could not sleep except for short intervals, then only to dream. I kept dreaming of Mr. Perkupp and Mr. Huttle. The latter was in a lovely palace with a crown on. Mr. Perkupp was waiting in the room. Mr. Huttle kept taking off his crown and handing it to me, and calling me President. He appeared to take no notice of Mr. Perkupp, and I kept asking Mr. Huttle to give the crown to my worthy master. Mr. Huttle kept saying, "No, this is the White House of Washington, and you must keep your crown, Mr. President." We all laughed long and very loudly, till I got parched, and then I woke up. I fell asleep, only to dream the same thing over again. End of chapter. The Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith. Read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter the last. One of the happiest days of my life. July the 10th. The excitement and anxiety through which I have gone the last few days have been almost enough to turn my hair grey. It is all but settled. To-morrow the die will be cast. I have written a long letter to Lupin, feeling it my duty to do so, regarding his attention to Mrs. Posh, for they drove up to our house again last night. July the 11th. I find my eyes filling with tears as I pen the note of my interview this morning with Mr. Perkupp. Addressing me, he said, "My faithful servant, I will not dwell on the important service you have done our firm. You can never be sufficiently thanked. Let us change the subject. Do you like your house, and are you happy where you are?" I replied, "Yes, sir, I love my house, and I love the neighbourhood, and could not bear to leave it." Mr. Perkupp, to my surprise, said, "Mr. Pooter, I will purchase the freehold of that house, and present it to the most honest and most worthy man it has ever been my lot to meet." He shook my hand, and said he hoped my wife and I would be spared many years to enjoy it. My heart was too full to thank him, and, seeing my embarrassment, the good fellow said, "You need say nothing, Mr. Pooter," and left the office. I sent telegrams to Carrie, Gowing, and Cummings, a thing I have never done before, and asked the two latter to come round to supper. On arriving home I found Carrie crying with joy, and I sent Sarah round to the grocer's to get 2 bottles of Jackson Frere. My 2 dear friends came in the evening, and the last post brought a letter from Lupin in reply to mine. I read it aloud to them all. It ran: "My dear old Gov, keep your hair on. You're on the wrong track again. I am engaged to be married to Lily Girl. I did not mention it last Thursday, as it was not definitely settled. We shall be married in August, and amongst our guests we hope to see your old friends Gowing and Cummings. With much love to all, from the same old Lupin." The end. End of recording.